This week we will begin discussing the hermeneutic of suspicion. This is, like the last issue, one that you have already raised in the course of our discussions. By hermeneutic, we mean a particular way of interpreting texts or other cultural artifacts. A hermeneutic of suspicion approaches its object, in this case religion, with the idea that it is concealing one or more hidden agendas. The hermeneutic of suspicion is associated above all with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. This week we will focus in particular on Marx's theory of religion, which is the most developed of the three. Marx is often understood as advocating a total rejection of religion as merely an instrument of control used by the ruling classes to focus the aspirations of the oppressed on the afterlife rather than on changing the world. While typical of many Marxists, this is not only a vast oversimplification, but in fact a radical distortion of Marx's position. Marx comes out of a long philosophical tradition which, following Plato, Aristotle, and the medieval Aristotelians, understood God as the power of being as such. The universe is a participation in this power, and the aim of human life is the cultivation of our distinctly human capacities in order to become as much like God as possible, with the understanding that it was quite impossible, however, to cross the boundary between contingent and necessary being. The one very partial exception to this limit was the possibility opened up by Christianity of theosis or divinization, not in essence to be sure, but as a kind of superadded quality bestowed on us by divine grace and then cultivated through human effort, which allowed us to love God with God's own love and thus become connatural with him. More specifically, however, Marx came out of the left wing of this tradition, which regarded religion as simply philosophy in imaginative form, philosophy for the masses, if you will. The role of philosophy was to comprehend the rational kernel within religious symbolism. This tendency, associated above all with the Andalusian Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd or Averroes, argued that humanity as a whole had one mind, the full development of which resulted in unity with the agent intellect, the angelic intelligence governing the sublunar or earthly realm. It was this agent intellect and not individual human beings which is immortal. This, in turn, tended to focus attention on interworldly civilizational activities such as politics, the arts, sciences, and philosophy. Somewhere along the line, however, probably because of the influence of Christian ideas regarding theosis, the idea that human beings were limited to unity with the agent intellect slipped away, so that eventually, by the time we get to Spinoza and Hegel in particular, we see the idea of human beings individually for Spinoza and humanity collectively for Hegel, achieving a kind of divinization. For Hegel, on whose work Marx considered his own a kind of commentary, this took place through the historical process, including the democratic revolutions which were transforming Europe in his time and making humanity the master of its own destiny. Still, Hegel believed that religion as such still had a place, even if it was increasingly subsumed under the authority of the state. One of Hegel's interpreters, however, Ludwig Feuerbach, argued that human beings were projecting their creative power onto another, that is, God, and that in order to complete the democratic revolution and unleash the full development of human potential, religion had to be overcome. Otherwise, people would remain passive and dependent on God. It's the ideas of Feuerbach which form Marx's starting point. When Marx criticizes religion, it is not because he rejects its aim, which is deification or the closest approach to deification of which we are capable, but rather its means and above all the locus of this deification. This is a quote from Marx. "Religion is the fantastic realization of a human essence that has yet to attain its true realization. Man, who sought a superhuman being in the fantastic reality of heaven and found nothing there but a reflection of himself, will no longer be inclined to find a mere non-human semblance of himself, where he seeks and must seek his true reality." The task of history is thus to establish the truth about this world once the other world has proved illusory. The immediate task of philosophy, which is in the service of history, is to unmask human self-alienation in its secular forms now that it has been unmasked in its sacred forms. Thus the critique of heaven is transformed into a critique of earth, the critique of religion into the critique of law, and the critique of theology into the critique of politics. Marx agrees with Feuerbach, in other words, that religion is the product of human self-alienation, of our tendency to project our own creative capacity onto another being, namely God. But Marx argues that we need to uncover the source of this alienating dynamic and resolve the problem at that source and not simply attempt to repress religion. Marx finds this source in the relationship between labor and capital. Marx argues that so long as people have to sell their labor power in order to survive, they will never be free, and indeed will become alienated from their own creative power, and thus project it on God. Again, a quote from Marx. This fact expresses merely that the object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor which has been embodied in an object, which has become material. It is the objectification of labor. Labor's realization is thus its objectification. Under these economic conditions, this realization of labor appears as a loss of realization for the workers. Objectification as a loss of the object and bondage to it. Appropriation as estrangement and alienation. Overcoming the commodification of labor power, reaching a point at which people no longer have to sell their labor power in order to survive, will, for Marx, lead to an end of this alienating dynamic. This, for Marx, is the only way to overcome religion, and it overcomes religion not by making human beings less spiritual, but by making them, in effect, divine. Here again is a quote from Marx. Communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore is the real appropriation of the human essence by and for humanity. Communism is the complete return of humanity to itself as a social and therefore human being, a return accomplished consciously in embracing the entire wealth of previous development. This communism, as fully developed naturalism, is a humanism, and as a fully developed humanism is a naturalism. It is the genuine solution of the conflict between humanity and nature and between human beings, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Communism is the solution to the riddle of history and knows itself to be this solution. Humanity's essence for Marx is, in other words, nothing less than existence or being as such. This is, we have seen, what the dialectical tradition has historically understood to be God. Religion seeks the realization of this essence beyond history in a mystical union with the divine. Philosophy, by which Marx means the tradition of radical Aristotelianism which reaches from the Latin Averroists through Spinoza and Hegel up to his own work, teaches us to seek it in this world. Liberal philosophy sought deification in the rationally autonomous individual. Democratic philosophy sought deification in the democratic state. Communism seeks it in human creativity itself, liberated from the chains of commodification, no longer required to sell itself in order to survive. There are a number of questions that can be raised regarding this theory. First, it is not clear that religion always and everywhere promotes political passivity. On the contrary, Marx, Engels, and Kautsky, as well as many later Marxist theorists, were aware of the long history of religiously inspired peasant revolts. And Moses Hess, a colleague of Marxism, one of the founders of Zionism, pointed out that the specific religion dominant in Germany in Marx's time, Lutheran and Pietistic Protestantism, was an unusual one in its emphasis on human sinfulness and its promotion of political passivity. Second, while Marx makes a powerful argument for the need to transcend the commodification of labor power if humanity is ever to be truly free, it is not clear how doing this would deify us. On the contrary, this seems in many ways like what many critics of religion have regarded as its false promises. Do this, and you will be saved. Perhaps it is more realistic to see the decommodification of labor power as bringing us one large step closer to the realization of our specifically human capacities. But our aspiration for something higher, and thus our spiritual drive and the creation of religious beliefs and practices that support that drive, will likely remain. What do you think? Is religion an expression of human creative capacity or an expression of its alienation? Does religion promote or hold back human creativity and liberation? I look forward to our discussion.